The story begins with U.S. Marshal Edward Daniels was traveling toward Shutter Island with his new partner, Chuck, for an investigation. Shutter Island was a lonely place where a mental hospital called Ashcliffe operated. The hospital held some of the most dangerous and violent mental patients in the country. Most of them were killers, criminals, or people who were extremely difficult to control. One of the female patients had suddenly disappeared from the hospital just one day earlier, and Edward and Chuck were being sent there to investigate. Soon, they reached Shutter Island. They met the deputy warden of Ashcliffe, who began taking them toward the hospital. As they got closer, Edward noticed that the entire facility was surrounded by high walls with electric fencing on top, making it look less like a hospital and more like a prison. Outside the entrance, the deputy warden collected their weapons and then started explaining how the place worked. He said there were 3 wards: Ward A for male patients, Ward B for female patients, and Ward C for the most violent and dangerous ones. Ward C was strictly off-limits without special permission, and anyone entering it had to be escorted by him or by the chief psychiatrist, Dr. Cawley. The deputy warden then introduced them to Dr. Cawley. He was calm and friendly, and he welcomed Edward and Chuck warmly. Then he began telling them about the missing patient. Her name was Rachel. Her husband had died in World War II, and after that her mental state had become extremely fragile. One day she drowned her 3 children in a lake. After that, she was brought to Ashcliffe for treatment. They tried their best to help her, but she refused to accept that she killed her children. She believed they were still alive, and she also believed that she was living in her own home, not in a mental hospital. In her mind, she had created a complete imaginary world, and she thought the staff and other patients were simply characters in that world: postmen, delivery men, milkmen, and so on. Dr. Cawley explained that Rachel had disappeared in an unbelievable way the previous night. Her door was locked, all exits were sealed, and her window had strong iron bars. It looked as if she had vanished from inside the room like a shadow. He showed Edward a picture of Rachel. The moment Edward looked at it, he saw an image in his mind of a child's dead body lying among other bodies. His head began to hurt sharply. He explained that he suffered from seasickness and that traveling on water made him ill. Hearing this, Dr. Cawley gave him medicine for the headache. After that, Dr. Cawley took them to Rachel's room. While searching, Edward found a small piece of paper hidden under the floor. 2 lines were written on it: "The Law of 4, and who is 67? The handwriting belonged to Rachel, and the message looked like a riddle, but even the doctor had no idea what it meant. Edward began to think that Rachel was trying to say something important through this puzzle. Next, Dr. Cawley took them to the hospital's common room. He explained that anyone leaving the hospital had to pass through this area. If Rachel had escaped, she would have walked through this room. But at night the place was never empty. Several staff members stayed there playing cards, so slipping out unnoticed was impossible. On the night she vanished, people were in the room, yet somehow she disappeared without being seen. This made Edward suspicious. He felt someone inside the hospital might have helped her escape. Otherwise, disappearing from a locked room was almost impossible. He asked Dr. Cawley to show him the files of every staff member on duty that night. The doctor hesitated and looked uncomfortable. He said he would think about it, but after Edward insisted, he agreed only to gather the staff in the common room later so Edward could question them. The deputy warden was already out searching for Rachel with the guards. Edward and Chuck joined him. The deputy warden believed that Rachel had to be somewhere on the island. There had been a violent storm the previous night. If she had tried to swim away, the waves would have smashed her into the rocks, and they would have found her body. But even after searching the entire island, they found nothing. Edward noticed an old lighthouse at a distance with 2 guards standing outside. He asked about it, and the deputy warden said it was just an old lighthouse now used for sewage treatment. His men had searched it completely, and Rachel wasn't there. But Edward found it strange that guards were posted outside a sewage facility. Still, he focused back on searching for Rachel. Evening arrived, and Edward and Chuck returned to the hospital. At night, they went to the common room where the staff had gathered. Edward questioned each person, but no useful information came out. During this process, he learned that Rachel's treatment was handled by a doctor named Sheehan. Edward immediately asked to meet him, but Dr. Cawley said that Dr. Sheehan had left on vacation that morning. Edward and Chuck were annoyed. A key doctor was gone just 1 day after his patient disappeared. Edward demanded to speak to him immediately. They tried to contact Dr. Sheehan over the radio, but because of the bad weather, They couldn't reach him. Later, Dr. Cawley took them to his home. There, another senior doctor, Dr. Naring, was present. He was a German psychiatrist who had been working at Ashcliffe for years. Knowing he was German irritated Edward because he had served as a soldier during World War II and had witnessed the brutal killings committed by the Nazis. He had developed a deep hatred for Germans. After some conversation, Edward again demanded the staff files, but Dr. Naring refused to give them. Edward lost his temper and said he would end the investigation right then, write a report, and send it to the FBI. He told them they were blocking his work. Then he and Chuck left. They returned to the hospital quarters where their sleeping arrangements had been made. That night Edward had a dream. He saw his wife Dolores standing in front of him. She had died 2 years earlier in an accident. She looked at him and said, "Edward, you cannot leave. Rachel never left. She is still here. And that lady too." Edward woke up suddenly. He looked outside the window. The storm had become worse. A staff member nearby told him that in such weather, no ferry could arrive, so they would have to remain on the island until the storm passed. Dolores's words echoed in Edward's mind. Maybe his inner voice was telling him that he shouldn't leave without finding Rachel. Later, Edward and Chuck met Dr. Cawley. Edward said he wanted to speak with all the patients who used to interact with Rachel. Maybe they could give some hint. Dr. Cawley was clearly troubled by the request, but he finally agreed. Edward and Chuck began interviewing the patients. They found that every patient repeated the same things about Rachel, exactly what Dr. Cawley had already told them, as if the lines had been rehearsed. Then Edward met a patient named Miss Kearns. When he asked her about Dr. Sheehan, her face suddenly changed. She only said that Dr. Sheehan was a good man. Then she asked Chuck for a glass of water. When Chuck went to get it, she picked up Edward's notebook and wrote something inside it. When Edward read it, his expression changed. Before Chuck returned, he placed the notebook in his coat. He then asked Miss Kearns one last question. "Have you ever met a patient named Andrew Letties?" She became nervous and said she had never heard the name. Then she stood up and quickly walked away. After finishing the interviews, Edward and Chuck discussed what they had learned. They still had no solid clue. Chuck then asked if Miss Kearns had said something when he went for water. At first, Edward hesitated, but then he showed him the notebook. Miss Kearns had written one word: run. Edward felt she was warning him of some danger. Chuck then asked who Andrew Letties was, since Edward had asked every patient about him. Edward explained that Letties was the man who set his apartment on fire, causing the death of his wife Dolores. He had escaped punishment due to lack of evidence. Later, Edward read in the newspaper that Letties had burned down a school during a mental breakdown, killing 2 people. He was sent to prison and then transferred to Ashcliffe, after which he had simply vanished. It was as if his records had been erased. Edward said he had tried to investigate Ashcliffe to find Letties, but no one was willing to talk. Eventually, he met a prisoner named George Noyce who was serving a life sentence at Dedham Prison. George told him that a year earlier he had been admitted to Ashcliffe because of mental issues. After a year, he was discharged, but once outside, he murdered 3 people as if the hospital had made him worse. In court, his lawyer tried to declare him insane again, but George refused and asked the judge for death instead. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment. George told Edward that Ashcliffe was conducting experiments on patients, and it seemed the same thing had happened to Andrew Letties. That was why all his records were erased. Edward believed that the government was secretly funding these illegal experiments, and if he could find Letties, he could expose the hospital. Chuck was shocked. He thought for a moment, and then said that right when Edward planned to expose the hospital, a patient conveniently disappeared and Edward was invited to investigate. With electric fencing everywhere and guards on every corner, how could any patient escape? Rachel had vanished from a locked room, and they still had no proof she had ever left it. Chuck suggested that maybe there was no Rachel at all. Maybe bringing Edward here was a trap to stop him from exposing the hospital. Edward was startled because he had never thought about it that way. Just then, they were called by Dr. Cawley for a meeting. When they arrived, the doctors were discussing the storm and the danger it posed. They feared a power cut. If the power went out, the cells would open and the violent patients could escape. Dr. Cawley reassured them that the hospital had backup generators. But Dr. Naring said that if the generators failed, all 66 patients would be loose, especially the ones in Ward C, who could be deadly. The number 66 made Edward pause. He remembered the note. Who is 67? The doctor said there were only 66 patients in the hospital. Was Rachel trying to say there was a 67th patient whose record was hidden? Edward asked about it, but Dr. Cawley interrupted him, saying the warden had already informed them that Rachel had been found. Edward was shocked. He and Chuck followed Dr. Cawley to Rachel's cell. Edward hoped she would finally give answers. Inside, Rachel seemed frightened at first, but after learning that Edward and Chuck were U.S. Marshals, she slowly began talking. Edward asked her what she had done the previous day. Rachel said she worked out in the morning, made breakfast for the children, sent them to school, and then went swimming in the ocean. She suddenly stopped because what came next was her drowning her children. The next moment she lunged toward Edward. The staff stopped him at the door. Edward felt disappointed after seeing Rachel's condition. He understood that he would not get any answers from her, so he walked out of the cell with Chuck. They went to Dr. Cawley's office, but before they could talk, Edward felt a sharp headache again. Dr. Cawley quickly gave him medicine and sent him to the basement, where the rest of the staff had gathered because of the bad weather. Edward was placed on a bed to rest. As soon as he closed his eyes, his painful memories turned into frightening dreams. He saw himself standing in a Nazi camp surrounded by piles of dead bodies. Among the bodies, Rachel was lying dead, holding the body of a young girl. Suddenly, the girl opened her eyes and asked him why he didn't save them and why he didn't arrive in time. Edward couldn't answer her. The next moment he found himself inside a house where Rachel stood nearby, and 3 dead children were lying on the floor. These were Rachel's own children, whom she had killed. One of them was the same little girl he saw in the dream earlier. Edward picked her up and held her close. Tears filled his eyes as he whispered that he was sorry he came too late. He woke up suddenly, shocked by his strange dream, and wondered why the same girl kept appearing again and again. He noticed chaos around him. Chuck told him that the electricity had gone out because of the storm, and even the backup generator had failed, causing panic everywhere. When they stepped outside, they saw that several patients had escaped from their cells. The staff and security were trying to control the situation. Chuck suggested that they should use this confusion to enter Ward C, because they might find Andrew Letty's there. Edward agreed. Both of them wore uniforms similar to the staff, so no one stopped them, and they entered Ward C without suspicion. Inside, a guard warned them that although most prisoners had been locked up again, a few were still loose and extremely dangerous. He told them not to try to stop any of them, or they could be killed, then walked away. As Edward and Chuck moved ahead, a patient suddenly appeared and ran away after seeing Edward. Thinking that it was Letty's, Edward chased him to the stairs. But the same patient jumped at him from behind and began choking him. Chuck shouted from somewhere, distracting the patient. Edward used that moment to injure the man and push him to the ground. When he looked carefully, he realized it wasn't Letty's. Chuck arrived with a guard, and together they took the patient away. Edward then continued searching for Letty's alone in the dark, terrifying cells of Ward C. Moving carefully, he heard someone repeating the name Letty's. Edward approached the voice and asked hesitantly if he was Letty's. The man laughed. When he stood up and came closer, Edward stepped back in shock. It was George Noyce, the man he had met in the Dedham prison, who had told him about the experiments happening at Ashcliffe. George's face was covered with fresh injuries, as if he had been beaten badly. Showing his wounds, George said these injuries were because of Edward, and because of him he had been brought back and locked inside. He told Edward that the people of Ashcliffe were playing a game with him. They made him believe he was investigating something, but everything was already planned. Edward refused to believe him, but George stared into his eyes and asked if he had been alone even for one moment since arriving. Edward admitted that Chuck had been with him the whole time. George asked if he had ever worked with Chuck before. When Edward said no, George told him that he was being deceived. He asked why Edward was still searching for Letty's and whether he still hadn't forgotten Dolores. He said that unless Edward let go of Dolores, he would keep chasing Letty's and never escape the island. Edward admitted he could not forget Dolores, which disappointed George. George told him that Letty's was not in Ward C, but in the lighthouse. Edward promised to get him out of there, then left to go to the lighthouse. On his way back, he met Chuck again, but George's words had made him suspicious. He asked Chuck where he had been. Chuck explained that he had taken the injured patient to the hospital and secretly checked the patient records. He showed Edward an intake form for patient 67, which clearly proved the patient existed in Ashcliffe. Edward didn't want to waste time and said he would read it later. Chuck tried to stop him from going to the lighthouse because it was getting dark and the path through the cliffs was dangerous. But this only made Edward more suspicious, so he refused to let Chuck join him and went alone through the forest. The forest path turned out to be impossible, so he returned to the spot where Chuck had been standing earlier. But Chuck was missing. Edward looked down from the cliff and froze in fear. Chuck's body was lying on the rocks below. Edward quickly climbed down, but by the time he reached the spot, Chuck had vanished. Searching around, he noticed a small cave hidden among the rocks with a light inside. He crawled in, hoping to find Chuck. Instead, he found a frightened woman hiding there. When he told her he was a U.S. Marshal, she allowed him inside. He asked who she was. She said her name was Rachel Sydow. Edward was shocked because the escaped patient's name was also Rachel Sydow. When he questioned her further, she said she was the real Rachel Sydow and had previously been a doctor at Ashcliffe. Edward was stunned. Rachel told him that illegal experiments were being done on the patients. Their brains were being surgically altered so they would become living corpses, capable of doing anything without question. When Rachel opposed these experiments, the hospital declared her insane and locked her inside. She managed to escape and now hid in the cliffs, changing places every day to avoid being caught. Edward realized that the woman he had met earlier in the hospital was an imposter meant to fool him. Rachel asked Edward if he had consumed anything from the hospital, cigarettes, coffee, or medicine. Edward thought for a moment and said he had taken medicine for his headache. Concern spread across Rachel's face. She told him it wasn't pain medicine. It was a drug that caused hallucinations and confusion, and its effects usually began within 36 to 48 hours. She said the first sign was trembling hands. Edward looked at his hands, and they were shaking. Worry filled his face. That night, he slept in the cave. In the morning, Rachel woke him and told him he had to leave. Edward promised to get her off the island someday, but she said the only way out was the ferry, and even that was controlled by Ashcliffe. Edward still believed he could expose the truth and escape. He left the cave and returned to Ashcliffe, where he ran into Dr. Cawley. Dr. Cawley asked where he had been and reminded him that since Rachel had been found, his work here was finished. He asked if Edward was preparing to leave the island. Edward looked anxious and said he and Chuck would soon leave. Dr. Cawley frowned and asked who Chuck was. He insisted that Edward had arrived alone. Rachel's warning echoed in Edward's mind. He realized Dr. Cawley was trying to confuse him. Not wanting to argue, he pretended to agree and said yes, he had come alone. Edward believed they had made Chuck disappear just like Letty's, probably taking him to the lighthouse for brain surgery. He quietly moved through the hallways, heading toward the lighthouse. But Dr. Naring suddenly blocked his path. He tried to distract Edward with conversation while secretly pulling out a sedative syringe. Edward noticed it and grabbed the syringe, injecting Naring instead. Naring collapsed. Without wasting a moment, Edward jumped over the boundary fence, dived into the sea, and swam to the lighthouse. Only one guard was present, and Edward attacked him from behind, taking his gun. He climbed the lighthouse stairs, ready for anything. But when he opened the door at the top, Dr. Cawley was calmly waiting for him. Edward pointed the gun at him, but when he looked around the room, there was no medical equipment and no sign of Chuck. Dr. Cawley told him the gun was unloaded. Edward checked the magazine and found it empty. On the desk, he saw Chuck's gun. He put down his own gun and stepped forward. Dr. Cawley called Dr. Sheehan upstairs. Hearing Sheehan's name shocked Edward, because he believed Sheehan was treating Rachel. Edward angrily asked if Dr. Sheehan had returned from leave. Cawley told him Sheehan had never left the hospital. He looked at Edward's trembling hands and asked if he was experiencing hallucinations. Edward said of course he was, because they were secretly drugging him. He claimed that Rachel had told him everything about their conspiracy. Cawley calmly said the symptoms were not from giving him drugs, but from stopping them. He said Edward had been admitted for 2 years, and the medicines he had been receiving had been discontinued, which caused withdrawal symptoms. He told Edward that Rachel was not real, and that she was a creation of his mind. Then he addressed him by another name, Andrew Letty's. Edward still refused to believe and angrily asked about Chuck. At that moment, the door opened and Chuck entered the room. Edward's eyes widened. Chuck walked over to stand beside Dr. Cawley, who introduced him as Dr. Sheehan, Andrew's psychiatrist for the past 2 years. Edward felt like the ground had collapsed beneath him. He grabbed the gun from the desk and fired at Cawley. Blood splashed everywhere, but Colley didn't fall. The blood disappeared in the next second. Edward looked at the gun. It was a plastic toy. Nothing had happened. It was all in his mind. Dr. Colley walked over with some photographs showing 3 dead children pulled from water. He asked Andrew if he would deny this too. Andrew stared at the girl in the photo. Memories flooded back. She was his daughter, Rachel. His eyes filled with tears as he realized he wasn't Edward. He was Andrew Letty's. 2 years earlier, his marriage had fallen apart. After returning from the war, Andrew had suffered from depression and buried himself in work and alcohol. His neglect pushed Dolores deeper into madness. One day she burned down their apartment. Andrew ignored the warning signs and moved the family to a lake house. After days of being away, he returned home and found Dolores sitting near the lake, soaked and silent. When he looked at the water, he saw their 3 children floating lifeless. Dolores had drowned them. Horrified, he pulled them out and collapsed. Dolores hugged him, begging him to free her from misery. Andrew realized she would never recover. Heartbroken, he shot her. After remembering everything, Andrew collapsed. When he woke up, he was in bed. Dr. Colley asked him to tell them why he was there. Andrew said with trembling words that he had killed his wife and lost his mind afterward. He said he was to blame for the death of his wife and children. Dr. Colley explained that Andrew's mind had created the entire case of a missing patient named Rachel Sydow and a mission to investigate her disappearance. His fantasies had kept him from facing the truth. To help him, the doctors built a role play around his illusions to show him that none of it was real. Colley explained that if they failed again, the board would force them to do a lobotomy on Andrew, leaving him a living shell. Andrew said he understood everything, but Colley reminded him that this was not the first time. 9 months earlier, the same treatment had worked, but Andrew had slipped back into his fantasy soon after. This was his last chance. If he reverted to Edward again, surgery was certain. The next morning, Andrew sat on the hospital steps. Colley and Naring watched him from a distance. They feared he might slip back again. Dr. Sheehan sat beside him and asked what he planned to do next. Andrew replied, "We have to get off this island, Chuck." Hearing the name Chuck again shattered Sheehan's hopes. Andrew had become Edward once more. Sheehan looked at Colley and signaled that the experiment had failed. Colley had no choice left. They moved toward Andrew to take him for the lobotomy. Andrew stood up and said quietly to Sheehan, "You know, Chuck, sometimes I wonder which would be worse, to live as a monster or die as a good man." Then he walked forward. Sheehan understood what he meant. Andrew hadn't forgotten anything. He remembered everything clearly. But he didn't want to live with the guilt of killing his own family. For him, living with those memories was worse than death. So he chose to act like he was still delusional, so they would perform the surgery and free him from his pain forever. The staff took him away for the lobotomy that would end his memories permanently. Many fans still debate the film's ending. Some believe Edward wasn't insane and the hospital manipulated him so their secret experiments would remain hidden. But this theory falls apart because when Dr. Colley first showed Edward the fake Rachel's photo, Edward immediately saw the young girl's face in his mind, even though the film never showed him that photo before. It proves the girl was always a part of his memories, not someone he saw in a Nazi camp. If she had been a real war victim, Dr. Colley would not have had her photo. This makes the second theory impossible. This confirms that Edward Daniels was actually Andrew Letty's, who lost his sanity after the tragedy, and the doctors of Ashcliffe tried everything to bring him back. If you liked this video, then I highly recommend these 2 videos on your screen.